US immigration policy has been one means by which those in power have created a sort of caste system within American society, sort of within which certain, there's a hierarchy, and people with certain immigration statuses are of higher status than others. At the top of that pyramid is folks who just do nothing other than happen to be born within the country, such as myself, and are automatically at the top of the stack. And then it goes down each of these levels to and lawful permanent residence is also known as green card holders, I should point out. And then all the way down at the bottom, people who don't have any lawful status in the US are who we refer to as undocumented many times. And that comes with, so this pyramid represents the hierarchy of social status as it plays out in our society, but it also represents a hierarchy of tangible rights, and with the level at the bottom having the least legal rights and constitutional protections, and those at the top having the most. And of course, these continuums are sort of very closely aligned with dynamics of race and class that we have in this country as well. I think it's not difficult for any of us to imagine the way those sort of tend to line up. So I wanted to talk about how our immigration system fits into the US federal government structure, because I think it's very telling of a lot of the problems that we have in the system. First of all, we have the three major branches of government, of the federal government, that perhaps most of us remember from middle school or something like that. And so you have the judicial, executive, and legislative branches. And basically everything within the immigration world is under the executive branch, also known as the president and everyone below him. So basically, the executive branch is the president, the vice president, the cabinet, and all of the different bureaucrats below them. And that massive bureaucracy is what contains our entire immigration system. And there are various agencies within the executive branch, like the Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services. All of these different cabinet level departments play different roles in the US immigration system. And there is, in my experience, horrible, if any, coordination in between these different departments regarding their different overlapping immigration duties. The Department of Homeland Security was not actually created until 2002 under George W. Bush in the fallout of 9/11, and sort of restructured the way that our government agencies deal with immigration. And that also it's telling how creating this Department of Homeland Security immediately paints, and putting all of immigration essentially within that, paints immigration as this security threat that we sort of have internalized both before and after that tangible change in the agency structures. And then these are the main players that we'll often hear about within the immigration world. Within the Department of Homeland Security, we have ICE, which is in charge of enforcement operations, basically the police and prosecutors of the immigration world. Then we have CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which includes the Border Patrol and any customs agents at airports and so on. We have USCIS, the Customs and Immigration Service, which handles any sort of petitions for immigration benefits, and so on. Is sort of a very administrative agency. And then we have what we call typically the immigration courts, which are actually housed separately within the Department of Justice rather than the Department of Homeland Security. Immigration courts, also known as EOIR, or the Executive Office for Immigration Review. So over here, we have the judicial branch of the federal government. And then down here, we have something that is under the executive branch, and yet we're calling it courts. And in these courts, we have immigration judges that we call judges. And yet again, they're under the executive branch. All of this is under the executive branch. So the main takeaway from this is that immigration courts are not real courts in the sense of belonging to any sort of neutral judiciary that is sort of removed from the president's reach. And immigration judges are essentially not quote unquote real judges. There's not even this they don't even feign neutrality really. We could argue separately about whether the federal judiciary is actually neutral. But our immigration courts don't even pretend. They do in the sense that they call themselves courts, but they're within the Department of Justice, led by Attorney General Barr, whose boss is Trump. All immigration judges answer to Trump and his underlings' policies. So this is one of the first this was sort of mind-blowing for me to realize this when I became introduced to the immigration world. And I think it speaks a lot to why immigration is so politicized. Immigration law can fluctuate so much from president to president and so on, because it's all within the president's discretion, essentially. And the other branches have very limited ability to intervene. So I wanted to highlight some differences in immigration court versus criminal court. For one thing, you're facing, so this is if someone is going through removal proceedings to be deported, which is what happens automatically if you show up to the country seeking asylum or so on, you're under Trump, automatically placed into deportation proceedings. And I think it's important to remember that the stakes you're facing are extremely high. Just because you cannot suffer criminal penalties does not in any way mean that there isn't an incredible amount on the line in these cases. However, unlike in criminal cases, in immigration court, there's no right to be provided legal counsel if you cannot afford it yourself, because it's not subject to the Sixth Amendment due process, which is just for criminal cases. As I said earlier, with regard to the immigration judges not being real judges, there's no neutral decision maker, or not even the sort of appearance of such. Because immigration detention is technically not supposed to be punishment, people in immigration detention have no Eighth Amendment protections against cruel or unusual punishment. Then the rules of operation within the immigration courts are just much looser and all over the place than in what I've been calling quote unquote real courts. One example of how this sort of plays out in the real world is these two different types of warrants that ICE agents, for example, might carry around on an enforcement operation. So if ICE shows up to somebody's house looking for someone that they're interested in deporting or detaining, they may come with a warrant, and it'll say warrant even if it came from themselves, from DHS, this agency, but basically, because they are not real courts, they don't have the authority to issue what I might call a real warrant or a judicial warrant that entails the authority to enter your home, for example. So oftentimes ICE agents will show up with this sort of administrative rather than judicial warrant, and people will open the door because they don't know the difference. And it's very important whenever possible for folks to ask for the warrant to be slid under the door, or or something of the like, so that it can be inspected to determine whether it came from an actual court, in which case they may have the authority to enter the home or not. So that's one example of how this sort of plays out. Now getting into the more recent developments in the immigration sphere. So it's important to note that while Trump has been horrendous for immigrants, and I would argue worse than Obama in most ways, his administration was horrible for immigrants on many levels as well. And he's often referred to as the deporter in chief for having deported more people during his presidency than any other president in history. So, you know, toward the end of his presidency, that waned a bit, and now under Trump, it's going back up again. But this is sort of, you know, how we got into this current situation of such mass deportations. One thing that Obama is generally praised for having done is instituting this program called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And just briefly, what that does is DACA basically provides deferred action for people who meet very specific, you know, I would argue problematic requirements that sort of, you know, value, you know, a certain narrative of good immigrant over the maybe less, what our government considers a less desirable form of immigrant, along lines of education and criminal record and so on, which, as most of us probably know, criminal records also are, in many ways are tied to racism and xenophobia and other forms of marginalization. And DACA does not provide any pathway to citizenship. So as you know, as probably everyone recalls, in 2017, the Trump administration announced they were canceling DACA. This past summer, the Supreme Court, you know, after the case was tied up in court for those few years, the Supreme Court struck down the Trump administration's plan, which was generally hailed by, you know, many Democrats as a great decision. However, it's very important to, you know, read the fine print and realize this decision, it was not saying Trump cannot rescind DACA. It was essentially just saying he didn't come up with a good enough rationale for why he was going to do it. And so it was basically just telling Trump's administration, go back to the drawing board and come back with a better reason and try again. Okay, so asylum has been, you know, all over the news for the last couple of years and everything, and there is indeed a humanitarian crisis going on at the southern border that I would argue is caused by the United States primarily. And so this chart sort of shows how the last couple of years have really blown up in terms of how many asylum applications there have been, and then also how many denials there have been, and how the denial rate has skyrocketed under Trump. So, and asylum is a status that is for people who can prove at a very high bar of proof that they have either experienced persecution or have a reasonable fear of future persecution on the basis of race, nationality, religion, particular social group, or political opinion. And this can actually be extremely difficult for many people who we might consider to have very valid, legitimate claims to meet. Yeah, asylum is generally under assault these days by the Trump administration, which on many different fronts is trying to dismantle the asylum remedies we have available and make asylum all but utterly inaccessible to anyone who needs it. So that is all. There is a lot of stuff there that is pending and still up in the air. I want to touch on immigration detention. This chart shows the rising rate of detention in the last couple of decades. I also want to point out that immigration detention takes place right in our own backyard. This is a map that is showing where facilities where immigrants are currently being or have in the recent past been detained for ICE. The top left pin up here is the federal ICE facility in Batavia, and the rest of these pins are local county jails, which are where many immigrant detainees around the country are housed. So this is something, as happens with criminal incarceration as well. People are, maybe many of the people being deported are actually coming from larger urban areas, but then they're being detained and shipped out to more rural areas. And the Finger Lakes is kind of right in the heart of some of that. These immigration detention centers also are completely part of the US prison industrial complex that we hear about all the time in the context of mass incarceration on the criminal side. The same two biggest private prison corporations, CoreCivic and Geo Group, from the criminal context are also the biggest players in the immigration context. And actually, private prison companies house a much larger portion of the detained population in the immigration context than they do in criminal. So there are, big corporate interests at play in immigration detention as well. The family separation policy, something that obviously a lot of people cared about, and just hit people hard emotionally as it should have when it hit the news. What basically was happening in legal terms with the family separation policy is that Trump really in 2017, but then officially announced in 2018, started implementing a zero tolerance policy, meaning that anyone who crossed the southern border without inspection, even if they were doing it to seek asylum, even if they had little kids with them, would immediately be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution for that. What I mentioned earlier was a misdemeanor improper entry. And if parents are being held in are being criminally prosecuted, then the US policy says they cannot be housed alongside their children, related to them possibly presenting a danger to their children, and so on. And so this zero tolerance policy resulted in massive family separations. And as of this past January, the reported numbers were that at least 4,368 children had been separated from their families through this Trump policy. And that number is likely an underestimate. And this policy was, quote unquote, officially halted in 2018, almost right after it hit the news, by a Trump executive order, as well as by some court injunctions and so on. But in reality, although maybe not to the same extent, family separations are still happening constantly at the border. And many of the children that were affected by that have yet to be reunited with their families. Okay, really trying to speed up toward the end here to make sure we still have some time for questions at the end, but I think it's really important to address two other, maybe slightly more obscure policies under Trump that have had a huge negative impact on immigrants at the southern border, which are metering and MPP. Metering is basically US immigration officials at the border will only allow a certain number of asylum seekers to request asylum per day as a way of preventing people from requesting asylum and deterring people from migrating here. And that has been creating enormous backlogs along the border, with some people waiting several months or longer just to get to the front of the line so they can ask for asylum, after which there may be years longer to wait for their asylum case to be adjudicated. And that that's where the migrant protection protocols comes in, because this is, a plan under which U.S. officials, once the person finally waits their 6 months or whatever and gets to the front of the line under MPP or the Remain in Mexico policy, officials are just turning back virtually everybody, supposedly not people from Mexico, but that's also, up for debate. But it's, they've been turning virtually everybody back to remain in Mexico to navigate their asylum cases from there, as opposed to either detaining them in the US or paroling them into the US to live in the US freely while they await their asylum cases, as has traditionally been done in the past. This is largely part of creating the humanitarian crisis going on ongoingly at the border. And of course, the COVID pandemic has made these situations far worse in the last 6 months or so, as these problems were already compounding and sort of egregious. And now just imagine all of that being just stalled for 6 more months, plus more people still arriving, still needing more services and needing to seek safety in the United States. So that's the bulk of the substantive content that I wanted to go through today. And I just wanted to close by trying to make some of this applicable, and just share some ideas for ways to put this knowledge into action. One, I suggest that folks continue to self-educate on immigration issues and spread that knowledge to others, help to eliminate misconceptions that are spreading, and just gain more literacy in the immigration world so that we can better respond to the attacks of our government's attacks on immigrants, and also so that we can practically support our immigrant friends and neighbors more effectively. I encourage folks to get involved in groups like the Finger Lakes Solidarity Network and Rapid Response Network, as well as supporting larger national or international organizations such as Al Otro Lado, where I worked over the summer, or Immigrant Defense Project in New York City, etc. And Trump is still releasing new proposed rule changes constantly that are just wreaking havoc on immigrant rights. And many of these comments have public comment periods, and anyone can post comments. So I encourage people to try and keep up to date on those things and submit comments, encourage others to submit comments in opposition, to build the record against these horrible policies and potentially stop some of them from happening. Of course, keep eyes on the prize. And one thing that I realized in putting this presentation together is it's a lot of incredibly depressing, discouraging information, and they're like, these issues are not super uplifting, and they're so numerous and heavy that it can feel very overwhelming at times to try and confront them. But I think that's exactly the strategy of the other side. And so I just urge everyone to continue to not to lose focus in the struggle for immigrants' rights in this incredibly difficult time.